So here I am at the Labour conference with Jude Darling, MEP, and we've just had a session here on trade and importantly what the EU does for UK trade. And the fascinating story was that, well, you better tell the story, but the overall message is that being part of a club and having the collective bargaining of the EU on standards is not just important for protecting quality that we all want to hold together, but in terms of global battling in the world for what we want with big players like the US, it makes a key difference. And there's a story that she has about how this made a big difference to British Steel. So.
Okay, so in the 1990s, I should say that before I was an MEP, I was a trade unionist. I led steel workers across Europe, and in the 1990s, the UK faced specific trade tariffs imposed by the US on specific grades of UK steel, and the UK government asked in Washington that these tariffs be reduced. UK steel, fantastic steel, was being exported to the US. US steel companies complained about the imports, and it was a protectionist tariff which was imposed on that UK steel. The UK government's pleading for the steel tariff to be lifted came to nothing, and it was only when the EU stepped in with the US administration and said, if you don't lift tariffs on UK steel imports, then we will impose retaliatory tariffs on US imports into the EU, that those protectionist measures which were hurting British steel jobs were lifted. And it's because being part of the EU 28, when we're out in the world, we're standing with our mates, if you like. We're standing together rather than standing alone in the face of global competition.
Yeah. So it's those European values actually getting together and having the collective weight, being 500 million against 320 million rather than 320 versus our 64.
Yeah.
In which case we just get American rules rammed down our throat.
Yeah,
and this,
right.
This was also what you were saying with regard to TTIP and the fact that it was EU pressure on farming standards and food quality standards that were really resisting the US, and you don't think that's going to be the case?
Well, I think there's a parity of power between the EU and the US, just in terms of scale, and the global economy, whether you like it or not, comes down to the power of the players in it.
Yeah.
And when you're 500
EU
million
and China, which
against
are the main
the US,
blocks.
Yeah, that's right. And we are going to be in the future negotiating with the US as a much smaller country, and also in a much weaker position, because Liam Fox is desperate for a trade deal. So he's made it clear that he'll accept US standards. This is about spheres of influence in a way, and the sphere of influence in the EU is a democratic and a social and an economic union of countries, against being in the sphere of influence of the US, where we have no influence over US policy, but we would be accepting what US standards come out. So it's just about what kind of economy, what kind of society you want in the future.
There's also experience, isn't there? Like, for example, I read that has been given legal advice that in terms of our trade negotiation readiness, we really shouldn't be diving for a UK-US deal first off without knowing how they work with other countries, because otherwise there's an extremely experienced team versus us, clearly desperate for a deal, and would be pretty much rolled over.
Yeah, and my experience, I mean, I'm in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, and my experience of trade negotiators is they're a pretty wily crop. We don't have trade negotiators at the moment in the UK. We're building up a team, and we're going into a world where the trade negotiators of the US, Australia, New Zealand, pretty much every other country have a lot of experience of what kind of trade negotiators they want. I think there's a real danger that we'll be a little bit taken for a ride, and I have real sympathy for our civil servants, because they're trying to get us up to speed as quickly as possible, but it's just the speed and the technical skills that are needed. You know, the clock is ticking on us, and the pressure to have something in place will mean that we will compromise, and this government is going to compromise on the things which are important for me, and I think they're important for you, Mike.
Yeah, well, I mean, in NHS stuff, it is the classic one here. In TTIP, it wasn't the UK that stopped TTIP, it was our common European colleagues. Also with Monsanto, collective bargaining against that. Smaller countries otherwise would have been rolled over. So if we have European standards, then it's this idea that, you know, clubbing together and having that collective bargaining makes a big difference.
That's right, that's right. But the thing that I like in particular about that story about the steel sector is we hear in a lot of anti-EU rhetoric that the EU has killed somehow the UK steel sector. That's absolute rubbish. Every single steel story as well. I represent the northeast of England, and I have worked my socks off to try and save steel in the northeast of England. It wasn't the EU which closed the steelworks in Redcar. It was a Tory government who didn't want to step in and to take the action that was needed. They didn't want to step in and save jobs in my region. And I refuse to let lies be told that it was because of EU state aid rules. Every other steel producing country in Europe stepped in and protected their steel sector. France, Italy, Germany, Austria, even the Scandinavians have taken action in order to ensure the future of their steel sectors. Our government didn't want to protect our steel sector until the campaign grew and it grew and it grew, and they were forced to ensure that Port Talbot stayed open. But they sacrificed Redcar, and I just really want to put to bed that lie that it was because of the EU that the Redcar Steelworks closed. It wasn't. It was because of the Tories, and don't let them ever get away with it.
It's a case of let globalisation gut communities find a scapegoat and then propose a solution, Brexit, which is going to do the same thing double dose.
And what Liam Fox is proposing, that we cut all of our tariffs, if we go to WTO rules, we cut all of our tariffs, we work on a unilateral basis, it won't just be the steelworks in Redcar, it will be our whole manufacturing industries which are absolutely decimated.
Manufacturing and farming.
Tens of thousands of jobs in the UK, and tens of thousands of good quality jobs that support many more jobs in our local economies. We can't let them do this. We just cannot let them do this. We have to have a sensible and a reasonable discussion about how we move forward. We may be leaving the EU. I don't want to. I'm a passionate Remainer. I don't care if that's unfashionable. We might not be, but we may be leaving the EU, but let's be sensible about how we do that, so that we protect jobs and we ensure that the least damage is done to our industries. And somebody said prop up unprofitable industries. No, we're not talking about that. These are advanced manufacturing industries, good quality jobs, but cutting tariffs will damage them.
And let's say you think farming is an unprofitable industry. Would you really like to see that undercut and taken away and have the food security go? So there are bigger and more complex issues than just surface level profitability. You need a heterogeneous economy, you need that robustness every developed nation does. So
well,
all right. Thanks so much for your time.
My first ever Periscope.
Yay! It was fun.
Brilliant.
Take care.
Cheers.
See ya.